On the night of December 27th, 2011, a man named Russ Faria drove home from a friend's house in Troy, Missouri, and found his wife dead on the sofa. She'd been stabbed 55 times. A kitchen knife was still in her neck. He called 911. He was hysterical. The 911 dispatcher who took the call would later tell reporters that there was no way he was faking it, that the sound of a man encountering what Russ Faria encountered that night is not something a person manufactures. The police arrived. They noted that Russ had an alibi. He had spent the evening with friends. He appeared on surveillance footage at a local Arby's at 9:09 p.m. 4 witnesses confirmed where he had been. The timeline did not place him at the house when his wife was killed. They arrested him anyway. He was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. And the woman who drove Betsy Faria home that night, the last person to see her alive, the woman who had changed herself to the sole beneficiary of Betsy's life insurance policy just 4 days before the murder, was interviewed, released, and never seriously investigated. Not for 4 years. Not until a defense attorney started pulling at threads that the prosecution had tucked very carefully out of sight. Her name was Pam Hupp. And by the time anyone with the authority to stop her was paying proper attention, she had already killed again. Before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel exists to tell the stories that ask the most uncomfortable question in true crime. Not who did it, but why did the people who were supposed to find out who did it look away? Hit subscribe right now. It costs you nothing. And it means these stories keep getting told. Now, let us get into it. Troy, Missouri sits about 55 miles northwest of St. Louis in Lincoln County. A mid-sized Midwestern town of the kind that has a good diner and a high school football team and families who have lived in the same county for 3 generations. It is not a place where people expect extraordinary violence. It is a place where people leave their cars unlocked and know their neighbors by first name and assume that the dangers of the wider world are happening somewhere else. Betsy Faria grew up knowing exactly what kind of place it was. She had built her life there. Her marriage to Russ, her relationships with her daughters from her first marriage, the social network of friendships that sustained her through the ordinary difficulties of adult life and then through something far less ordinary. Betsy had been diagnosed with cancer, and the specific nature of her diagnosis is documented. She had been receiving chemotherapy treatments and the prognosis was not good. She was terminally ill in the way that phrase actually means when it is not softened by euphemism. She was going to die from her disease, and she knew it, and the people who loved her knew it, and the question that framed her daily life in the months before December 2011 was not whether, but when. She was 42 years old. Russ Faria was the kind of husband that people who knew them described with the specific warmth of someone who has watched a relationship work well over time. He was present. He was involved. He drove her to appointments, sat with her during treatments, managed the household around her illness with the practical devotion that serious illness requires from a partner. And they had disagreements. What marriage doesn't? But the picture of their relationship that emerged from the people who knew them was of 2 people genuinely committed to each other, navigating something genuinely terrible together. Pam Hupp had been Betsy's friend for some years. They had met through work, and the friendship had deepened into the kind of closeness that women who share difficult experiences sometimes develop. A mutual trust built through the particular intimacy of someone who shows up, who makes time, who positions themselves as indispensable. Pam drove Betsy to chemotherapy appointments. She sat with her. She was, by the account of Betsy's other friends and family, a constant and caring presence in Betsy's life during the illness. And what nobody knew, what Betsy herself may not have fully understood, was what Pam Hupp was building toward. In the weeks before December 2011, Betsy made a change to her life insurance policy. The policy was worth $150,000. She changed the beneficiary. The original beneficiary had been Russ. The new beneficiary was Pam Hupp. The date of that change was December 23, 2011, 4 days before Betsy was murdered. Later, when investigators and attorneys began pulling at this detail with the scrutiny it deserved, questions emerged about how that change had come about. Had Betsy understood what she was doing? Had she been persuaded? Had someone with knowledge of insurance policies and the particular vulnerability of a terminally ill woman who was worried about her husband's finances used that vulnerability to engineer an outcome? These questions were never fully answered in court because the jury at Russ Faria's first trial was never told about the beneficiary change at all. The prosecution kept it out. On December 27, 2011, Betsy Faria had a chemotherapy appointment. She was, by the accounts of people who saw her that day, weak and lethargic in the way that chemotherapy patients are after a session. Depleted, slightly disoriented, in need of rest. She went to her mother's house after her appointment. She was with friends, playing board games, the kind of ordinary social comfort that people reaching for normalcy in abnormal circumstances create for themselves. So Pam Hupp arrived at the mother's house. She had not been invited. She came anyway. She insisted on driving Betsy home. Betsy texted Russ during the evening. The text is in the court record. She wrote, "Pam Hupp wants to bring me home to bed. She offered and I accepted." That was the last message Betsy Faria sent to anyone. Pam Hupp drove her home. She later told police she had not gone inside. She had dropped Betsy at the door and left. She had not gone inside the house. She was certain of that. Russ Faria came home at approximately 9:40 p.m. after spending the evening with friends. What he found on his sofa is documented in the crime scene photographs that would later play a significant role in his defense. His wife had been stabbed 55 times. A knife was in her neck. She was dead. He called 911. And the investigation that followed would demonstrate over the next 4 years exactly how badly a system can fail when it decides what happened before it has properly looked at what happened. Before we go further, if you are still with me, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it interesting to know where these stories are reaching. Take a breath. We are about to go somewhere darker. The Lincoln County investigation moved quickly in the direction of Russ Faria. The reasoning, in the context of how domestic homicide investigations typically proceed, was not irrational on its surface. Statistically, when a married woman is murdered in her home, the husband is the most likely perpetrator. That statistical reality shapes how investigators approach crime scenes, how they weigh evidence, and how they construct a theory of the case in the critical early hours when impressions solidify into assumptions and assumptions harden into conclusions. The problem was the alibi. Russ Faria had 4 witnesses who could account for his whereabouts that evening. He had surveillance footage from a local Arby's placing him there at 9:09 p.m. The drive from that Arby's to the Faria home took a minimum of a certain amount of time. And that time, when placed against the estimated time of Betsy's death, made his presence at the scene during the murder essentially impossible. The investigators knew about the alibi. They pursued Russ anyway. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Leah Askey, a newly elected Lincoln County prosecutor who enlisted the Missouri Attorney General's office and the Major Case Squad, a conglomeration of homicide detectives from across the region, to assist with the investigation. The prosecution's theory was that Russ had killed Betsy for her life insurance money. This was the motive. This was the architecture around which the case was built. There was a significant problem with that theory. Russ was not the beneficiary of the life insurance policy. Pam Hupp was. The change had been made 4 days before the murder. But the jury at Russ Faria's first trial, which began in November 2013, was not told this. The beneficiary change, the single most significant piece of financial evidence in the entire case, the fact that directly undermined the prosecution's stated motive, was kept from the jury. Russ Faria was convicted on November 18, 2013, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He had been at an Arby's. During the years that Russ was in prison, his defense attorney Joel Schwartz continued working the case. He had known during the first trial that something was deeply wrong, not just with the evidence but with the way the investigation had been conducted, the way the prosecutor had shaped the case. Do you know the way a woman who was the last person to see Betsy alive and who had just made herself the beneficiary of Betsy's life insurance policy had been interviewed once, released, and apparently forgotten? Schwartz built his case for a new trial on 2 foundations. The first was the evidence that had been withheld. More than 100 photographs of the crime scene had not been provided to the defense. A detective had testified at trial that the police camera had malfunctioned. The photographs, when they were finally obtained, told a completely different story from the one the prosecution had presented. They showed that the house had not been cleaned of blood, the way the prosecution had suggested. They showed blood evidence inconsistent with the prosecution's theory of what had happened. The second was Pam Hupp. Cell phone tower data showed that Pam Hupp's phone had been in the area of the Faria home for approximately 30 minutes longer than she had claimed. She had told police she dropped Betsy at the door and left. The cell tower data suggested she had stayed. She had told police she had not entered the house. Her story changed over the course of multiple interviews. She eventually acknowledged going further into the house than she had initially stated. Every version of her account shifted to wherever the potential evidence was, as Schwartz would later observe. Wherever there was evidence to be found, her story expanded to include it. In June 2015, Russ Faria was granted a new trial. In November 2015, at a bench trial before Judge Stephen O'Meara, with the Pam Hupp evidence now before the court, Russ Faria was acquitted of both charges. He had spent nearly 4 years in prison for a crime that the evidence strongly suggested he did not commit. Lincoln County later settled his civil rights lawsuit for $2 million. Here is what was happening while Russ Faria was in prison. After Betsy's murder, Pam Hupp collected the $150,000 from the life insurance policy. She had testified at Russ's first trial that she intended to put the money in a trust for Betsy's daughters. The daughters were Betsy's children from her first marriage, 2 young women who had just lost their mother and who had been told that the friend their mother trusted most was going to ensure they were taken care of. Pam Hupp kept the money. All of it. When Betsy's daughters sued her, Hupp was deposed. In that deposition, she admitted she had never put a single dollar into a trust for them. She had told a court of law in a murder trial that she was going to take care of the daughters of the woman she had killed. And then she had taken the money and done nothing of the kind. Nobody charged her for that. Nobody was charged for anything. Russ Faria was in prison, and Pam Hupp was in O'Fallon, Missouri, with $150,000 and no consequences. And a former employee of the prosecutor's office would later tell reporters, "There were several of us that kept thinking, why are we not pursuing Pam Hupp?" Before Betsy Faria's murder and before Russ's conviction was overturned, something had happened to another person close to Pam Hupp. Her mother. Shirley Neumann was Pam Hupp's elderly mother. In 2013, she died after falling from a third-floor balcony at an assisted living facility in Fenton, Missouri. The fall was initially ruled accidental. Pam Hupp was the beneficiary of her mother's life insurance policy. After Pam Hupp's arrest in 2016 for a separate murder, which we will come to, the chief medical examiner, Mary Case, reviewed Shirley Neumann's death and changed the cause from accidental to undetermined. The St. Louis County Police Department reopened the investigation. Their findings were inconclusive. No charges were ever filed in connection with Shirley Neumann's death, but the pattern was now visible to anyone who looked at it. So a terminally ill friend changed her life insurance beneficiary to Pam Hupp 4 days before she was murdered. Pam Hupp's elderly mother died in a fall from a balcony. Pam Hupp was the beneficiary. The only consistent connecting thread across both deaths was money, and the person whose name appeared on both insurance policies was the same woman. By 2016, Russ Faria's acquittal had put Pam Hupp's name back in the public conversation about Betsy's murder. Reporters were writing about her. Investigators outside Lincoln County were looking at her. She was not charged with anything yet, but she could feel the attention moving in her direction. And what she did next is the moment in this story that makes every person who hears it sit completely still. She decided to create a diversion, not a subtle one, not a legal one, not a manipulation of paperwork or a change of story or a careful repositioning of her account of December 27, 2011. She decided to create a diversion by committing another murder and blaming it on Russ Faria. His name was Louis Gumpenberger. Louis Gumpenberger was 33 years old. He had been in a serious car accident in 2005 while intoxicated and had sustained brain injuries that left him with significant mental and physical disabilities. He was, in every sense of the word, a vulnerable person. Someone who would have difficulty understanding a complicated situation, who could be confused and manipulated, who had limited capacity to protect himself from someone who intended him harm. Pam Hupp found him. The exact mechanics of how she identified Louis Gumpenberger and approached him are documented in the investigation. She contacted him with the offer of money to participate in what she described as a reenactment of a 911 call for what she said was a Dateline NBC program. She had in fact approached at least one other person with a similar pitch in the days before August 16, 2016. a woman who initially agreed and then backed out when Pam could not produce any credentials. The other woman reported the encounter to police. The police did not connect it to anything at the time. On August 16, 2016, Louis Gumpenberger got into a car with Pam Hupp. She drove him to her home in O'Fallon. She shot him dead. Then she called 911. Her story, delivered to the 911 dispatcher and then to the police officers who arrived, was that Gumpenberger had been a stranger who had ambushed her in her driveway. Ham demanded at knife point that she take him inside and give him Russ's money, meaning the Faria insurance money, and that she had shot him in self-defense after he followed her into her bedroom. In Gumpenberger's pockets, the police found $900 in cash and a handwritten note. The note listed instructions to kidnap Pam Hupp, retrieve the money connected to the Faria case, and then kill her. The note was in Pam Hupp's handwriting. The $900 was money she had given him as payment for the 911 reenactment she had promised. She had written the note herself, placed it on his body after she shot him, and then called 911 to report that a disabled man had tried to kill her on instructions from the man she had already helped put in prison once. The surveillance camera on her own home captured the license plates of her SUV arriving at the property with Gumpenberger inside. She was arrested 7 days later. Before she was booked, she asked to use the restroom. She stabbed herself in the neck and wrists with a ballpoint pen. Here is the detail that reframes the entire Pam Hupp case. She had worked in the life insurance industry for years before any of this began. She had been fired from 2 positions in that industry for forging signatures. The specific skill set required to identify a terminally ill woman, understand the mechanics of a life insurance beneficiary change, persuade that woman to make the change at the right moment, and then act on it. That skill set was not something she developed for Betsy Faria. She had been building it and practicing it, what for her entire adult professional life. The forgeries that got her fired were not aberrations. They were rehearsals. In June 2019, Pam Hupp entered an Alford plea in the case of Louis Gumpenberger's murder. An Alford plea is a specific legal mechanism that allows a defendant to acknowledge that the prosecution has sufficient evidence to convict them while not admitting personal guilt. She did not say she killed Louis Gumpenberger. She said the state could prove she did. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is currently serving that sentence at Missouri's Chillicothe Correctional Center. In July 2021, Lincoln County prosecutor Mike Wood charged Pam Hupp with the first-degree murder of Betsy Faria. The charge that everyone who had looked carefully at this case had believed was coming for years had finally arrived. And the charging document stated that Hupp had waited until her friend was weak and lethargic from a chemotherapy session before attacking her. That she had stabbed Betsy Faria 55 times as she lay on the sofa under a blanket. That she had then taken deliberate steps to stage the scene, dipping the victim's socks in her own blood, spreading blood evidence around the house to implicate Betsy's husband in what she intended to look like a domestic assault. Pam Hupp pleaded not guilty. As of the time this script was written, her trial in the Betsy Faria murder case has not yet concluded. She remains in prison on the Gumpenberger conviction. The Faria case is moving through the legal system with the specific slowness of a case that has already been through a wrongful conviction, an acquittal, a civil settlement, and a decade of contested evidence. Russ Faria, the man who spent nearly 4 years in prison for a crime the evidence says he did not commit, received his $2 million settlement from Lincoln County. He has remarried. He has spoken publicly about the experience of being convicted and imprisoned for killing the woman he loved. The specific horror of it, the years inside while the person responsible was outside, the knowledge that a system full of people who had access to the same information he had access to chose to look in the wrong direction. The prosecutor from the first trial, Leah Askey, has maintained that her conduct was above board and that she prosecuted the case based on the evidence the police gave her. No criminal charges have been filed against her. In June 2025, a former sheriff's deputy named Michael Merkel was charged with perjury for allegedly giving false testimony in Russ's trial, specifically for testifying that crime scene photographs had failed to develop, when more than 100 of those photographs were later discovered and given to the defense. The photographs did not fail to develop. They existed. They had always existed. They showed something different from what the prosecution said they showed, and a man went to prison in part because a court was not allowed to see them. Betsy Faria's daughters, the daughters who were told that the money from their mother's life insurance policy was going into a trust for them, who had their mother taken from them and then had the woman responsible take the compensation that was supposed to reach them, have spoken publicly about the case over the years with the particular composure of people who have been forced to process something enormous and have found that composure is the only tool available to them. They did not get the money. They did not get their mother back. What they got, eventually, was the knowledge that the person responsible is in prison and the knowledge that a second trial is coming. Louis Gumpenberger's family received nothing that approaches justice. He was a man with disabilities who was manipulated and murdered by someone who saw his vulnerability as a resource. His death was not even the primary crime Pam Hupp was trying to commit. He was a prop. Not a piece of staging in a performance designed to deflect attention from a murder she had already gotten away with for 5 years. He died because Pam Hupp needed a body that could plausibly be explained as a threat, and he was the most exploitable person she could find. That is what she reduced him to, a prop. And the system that is supposed to prevent exactly that kind of exploitation had already demonstrated in the Betsy Faria case that its attention could be directed away from the right person if the wrong person was willing to work hard enough at the misdirection. There is a question at the centre of the Pam Hupp case that the legal proceedings have never fully resolved and may never fully resolve. Not whether she is guilty. The evidence on that is as clear as it gets. She is in prison for one murder and charged with another, and the pattern of her behaviour across 2 decades, viewed from any honest angle, is the pattern of a person who identified financial targets and removed the human beings standing between herself and the money. The question is why the system gave her so much room. A former employee of the prosecutor's office said it plainly. There were several of us that kept thinking, why are we not pursuing Pam Hupp? That statement is remarkable not because it reveals wrongdoing, it may not, but because it reveals that the doubt was present inside the system from very early on. People inside the investigation had the doubt. They expressed it to each other. And the machine of the prosecution moved forward anyway toward Russ Faria, away from the woman who had been in Betsy's house that night and walked out with the insurance money. There are several answers to why that happened, and none of them are fully satisfying. The statistical tendency to look at husbands first, the political pressure of a new prosecutor who needed a conviction, the confirmation bias that locks an investigation into a theory once it has one, the specific difficulty of prosecuting a woman whose entire social presentation was one of devoted friendship and community involvement. All of these things were real. All of them shaped what happened to Russ Faria. But underneath all of them is something simpler and more uncomfortable. Pam Hupp was very good at this. She had been practicing in smaller ways for years before Betsy Faria. She knew how insurance worked. So she knew how beneficiary changes worked. She knew how to position herself as indispensable to a vulnerable person. She knew how to present herself to investigators in a way that did not alarm them. She knew, on some level, that the system had predictable habits, that it would look at the husband first, that it would value a sympathetic witness, that it would be reluctant to pursue the grieving friend. She built her entire plan around those habits, and they held long enough for a second person to die. The Pam Hupp case is sometimes discussed in true crime circles, primarily as a story about a wrongful conviction, about Russ Faria and the 4 years he lost, and the system that failed him. And it is that. It is absolutely that. But reducing it to Russ's story misses the larger architecture of what Pam Hupp actually was. Like, she was not someone who snapped or acted impulsively or made a terrible decision in a moment of desperation. She was a person who spent years identifying vulnerable targets, studying the financial mechanisms that would transfer their assets to her, positioning herself as trustworthy and indispensable, and then acting with a patience and precision that speaks to a long, deliberate development of a very specific capability. The forgeries in the insurance industry were not the beginning. They were the visible surface of something that had been developing much longer. The termination from 2 jobs for forging signatures was not a consequence that stopped her. It was information that refined her approach. She learned from it. She learned what the system caught and what it did not catch. She learned where the gaps were. And she filed that knowledge away and used it. That is not the profile of someone who committed a crime. That is the profile of someone who built a career out of it. and the habits held long enough for her to collect the money and walk free for 5 years. Betsy Faria texted her husband on the night she died. She said, "Pam Hupp wants to bring me home to bed." She said, "She offered, and I accepted." She trusted the person who had spent weeks positioning herself to be trusted. She got into a car with the last person she would ever see, and she went home. That is the thing about Pam. She was very good at making people feel safe. A man spent 4 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. A disabled man was murdered as a prop. A woman's daughters never got the money they were promised from their mother's life insurance. And the person responsible sat in O'Fallon, Missouri for 5 years while people inside the investigation asked each other why nobody was pursuing her. If this story stayed with you, and I think it will, share it with one person today. Subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this stayed with you the longest. Tell me what you think about the system that gave her 5 years. I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.